Okay, it's time to get started. Thank you everyone for joining our live lecture today. My name is Isaac and I'll be the lead instructor for the lecture. And today's topic will be front-end frameworks in React Part 1. So what that means is this lecture will cover the first half of the React curriculum. So if you're in that section, this is a lecture for you. Couple things to mention before we get started today. The first one being is that we are going to stop periodically throughout this lecture to open the floor for questions. So if you do have those come up along the way, we just ask you wait until those designated times to ask them. Another thing to mention is that we're recording this lecture. So once we're done here, we're going to be posting it on our YouTube channel. We'll make that link available to you in your student resources. So diving right in, let's navigate to reactjs.org. Okay, and this is the official website for the React library. Okay, and as you can see right here, it spells it out real nice and easy for us. React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Okay, and like most JavaScript libraries, it excels really well at one thing, and that one thing is rendering. Okay, and so in short, before React, the typical JavaScript frameworks tended to take the approach of re-rendering the entire DOM anytime there was a change. And now React uses what's called a virtual DOM to simply compare it to the real DOM and only update the necessary changes instead of just updating the whole thing. And of course, that increases the performance of the page load and everything else. So that being said, let's go ahead and let's navigate to the student dashboard. And once you're in the student dashboard, let's go ahead and let's go to the first section for React, setup and rendering with React. And from there, we can install the starter kit. Okay, and as you can see, I've already installed it on my desktop. So I'm just going to take a moment to change directories into that starter kit. I'm going to open it up in my text editor. Okay, so we'll just give that a minute to boot up here. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's get rid of those ghost files and let's just walk up the file tree here and talk about what's going on with the starter kit. Okay, so first we have Webpack. Okay, and you don't really need to understand how to build Webpack from scratch or anything to that nature. Just know that Webpack's doing a couple primary things. Okay, so the first one is it's bundling all of our source code. It's making it available in our public through a single bundle.js script. Okay, and then it's also loading in Babel so that we can use the latest JavaScript edition with all browsers. So next we have a package.json file, and this contains a mixture of like some metadata, right? It's just informational about the app, but then we do have some dependencies that are listed that we need to install to run this. So let's take a moment to do that, and we can do it really easy by running the command npm install. Okay, now it's just going to take a couple of minutes to go through each of those dependencies and download them one by one for us. Okay, looks like we're about halfway there now. Just let it finish up. Okay, it looks like we're in the final stretch here. We got like the node modules imported here in our file tree, right? And that's the parent folder for all these modules here. Okay, so we'll just let it wrap up. Okay, perfect. So now that we've installed all of those, let's go ahead and let's direct our attention to the source. Okay, and source is where we're going to write all of our React logic. Okay, and as you can see right now, it just has some simple JavaScript running. Okay, and that's being loaded here in the index through the bundle.js script. Okay, and the idea here is for this root element is we're going to be mounting different React user interfaces using this root element to render. Okay, so now we have a better understanding of what's going on in our file tree. Let's go ahead and let's reference the command start, npm start, so we can start a Webpack server. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run that now. Okay, and as you can see, it launches it at localhost 8080 for us, and it runs the script that's located inside index.js. Right? So we know that our basic setup is working here. So now let's talk about how we can render with React. Okay, so first thing we need to do, we need to import the React and React DOM modules. Okay, and so I'm going to say import React from React, and then we'll say import. Oops, it should be uppercase. Here we go, and then we'll say import React DOM from React-DOM. Okay, and so React, of course, is the core library itself, and then React DOM is what allows us to render the React elements. Okay, so how we render a React element, let's just say we want to do a simple H1 hello world. Okay, so how we would do this, we would say React DOM dot render, and then we pass in two arguments. First argument is what we want to render, and the second argument is where we want to render it. So, for example, I'll say React dot create element. Okay, and the element I'm creating is an H1. Okay, that's the parent. Okay, and then I'm going to pass in null for what's called the props. We'll get into more of what those are a little bit here. And then we have to pass in the child, which is like the text in between the H1 tags, right? So I'm going to say hello world. Looks like I misspelled that. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, so now we put a comma to separate the first argument from the second, and now I need to tell it where to render. So I'm going to say document get element by ID, render in the root element. If you remember, the root is what we have here in our public, right? That's the main element here. So let's take a moment to save that, and we watch our compile here. And it's successful, so we go back to our browser, and we can see that we're getting hello world rendered, right? So we know that that is successful. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about how we can nest React elements within each other. Okay, so if I wanted to have maybe an unordered list of to-dos, I would approach it like this. I would say React create element, and then I would pass in an unordered list for the parent, null for the props, and then for the children, I would pass in more React elements. Okay, so I'd say React create element, and it'll be a list item with null for the props, and then the text could be something like workout. Okay, and then I can pass in even more children by just separating them with a comma here. Okay, so I'll say workout, I'll say grocery, shopping, and we'll say coding. Okay, those are our three to-dos. So we save all, watch it compile, that's successful. And back in our browser, we can see that we have those three list items, right? And so this is how we can render single parent items, or I'm sorry, single parent elements, or single or multiple, right? Nested. It just depends on your situation, but more than likely you're going to need to nest elements at some point. So this is how we do it. So next, let's talk about JSX. Okay, and JSX stands for JavaScript and XML. And in a nutshell, it's going to allow us to work with these React elements a lot easier by parsing raw HTML markup into a React element for us. Okay, so for example, using JSX, If I wanted to greet someone with a simple header tag, I could do something like this. I could just say H1 open, hello world, H1 close. Okay, and then I'll just separate with the comma and I'll tell it to mount on the root. So from here, let's save all. And when it refreshes, we can see that it's rendering hello world. Okay, and as you can see, using JSX, this is much easier on the eyes, right? We're already used to writing HTML markup. And this way, we don't have to say React create element over and over and over again every time we want an element. We can simply just use raw HTML, okay? And JSX will parse it into a React element for us. So knowing that, let's go ahead and create a nested element. So I'm just going to create a parent unordered list, opening and closing. And then between the unordered list, I'm going to pass in list items. Okay, so maybe I will say climb a mountain. That's the first one. Okay, maybe the second one is change car oil. And maybe the third one is to take a nap. Okay, so we got our to-dos, right? It's rendering the single parent with the children nested inside it. So we save all here, compiles, and we can see that we get that nice unordered list, right? And again, we're just using, you know, what we're already familiar with. And at this time, it might feel a little weird that you're putting your HTML in like a JS file, right? And you're mixing it with your JavaScript. It can feel very unpleasant at first if you're used to separating those, okay? And that's actually the traditional approach, is to separate your concerns. However, if you give yourself a bit of time with React, I think you'll find that once you adapt to it, you actually like it a little more because everything's nice and in one place and organized by a component-like structure. So we'll get into more what that means here down the line. But for now, let's go ahead and go over some of the other features of JSX and what we can do with parsing. Okay, so we can parse our raw HTML into a React element, but we also can parse variable values as well if needed. So for example, I can create 3 to-dos. Maybe I'll have to-do 1. And let's have this one say, take a dog for a walk. Okay, that's our first to-do. Let's create a to-do number 2. And let's make this one clean the bedroom. Okay, and to-do number 3, let's make this one to cook lunch. Okay, so that's our to-dos. So what we could do is we could pass these in and parse them using JSX with this bracket symbol. Okay, so I'm just going to say to-do 1, and I'm going to pass in to-do number 2, and finally to-do number 3. Okay, let's see here. Close that up, and now instead of passing in hard-coded values, we're passing in these dynamic values from the variables, right? So let's go ahead and save all, and let's refresh. And as we can see, we get our new list, right? And now, anytime we update these variables, it'll in turn update the list, okay? So let's just go ahead and test this out. Let's just say 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we save all. JSX parses the variables into their given values, and we get that new list, right? So that's how we can use variables with JSX. Next, let's talk about destructuring. Okay, so destructuring is a very common approach to bringing in like imports and their various methods. So let's go ahead and let's look at an example of destructuring. So for example, I could throw a simple object together by saying let person and have a name, and we could have an age, okay? And I could acquire the values from this by using destructuring in this way. So I could say let name equals person, okay? And then let's go ahead and console log the value of name, okay? So we open up our inspect tool here. And as we can see, we're getting the value of Isaac, okay? And that's because we destructured, right, the value from this name field here, okay? And so in the same approach, we can do that with our module imports. We can destructure and only import what we need from them instead of just the entire library itself. So React DOM is a good example of this. 9 times out of 10, we're only going to use React DOM for its render method, and we don't really care about anything else. So if that's the case, we can just destructure the render method like this, okay? And now I have access to that render method from, you know, the React DOM module, and I didn't have to import the entire library itself, okay? So that's how we can set that up. Next, let's talk about how we can use functions with JSX, okay? So let's say we want a function that will produce a list of to-dos. So what we could do is we could say function, and we could call it to-do list, okay? And then we could have it return some markup, okay? So we'll start with a parent unordered list tag, and then let's go ahead and throw in some list items, okay? And then we're gonna use the parameters passed in to populate these list items, right? So what we would need to do is in our render method down here, we would need to invoke to-do lists and pass in the appropriate to-dos. So I'm gonna say, go for a jog. That will be our first to do. Our second one will be to, maybe we'll hit the gym. And third, we will take piano lessons. Okay, so we have our 3 to-dos, so we'll just populate that with to-do 1 and to-do 2 and to-do 3. And then we can pass those in and use JSX to parse the values of each parameter. Okay, so I'm going to say to-do 1, to-do number 2, and to-do number 3. Okay, and then we'll just separate the function with a comma and tell it to mount on the root element. Okay, and because when we invoke this function, it's going to return markup, that's what's going to be, you know, rendered as the first argument. So let's go ahead and let's save all. And we go to our browser, and we can see that we're getting the appropriate given list items, right? And we did all that with, you know, a function. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and let's discuss how we can deal with collections of unknown quantities, and we can display those accordingly, okay? So let's say we have a list of to-dos, okay? And we don't know how many to-dos we have, okay? So let's just pass some random ones in. Vacuum will be one to-do, dishes will be another one, take out trash, that'll be another one, clean kitchen, that'll be another one, and let's do one last one, to dust, yeah, just dust. Okay, so now we have our to-dos, okay? How we can deal with this is use the map method to iterate and produce a new array full of list item elements in which we can display. Okay, so I'm going to say let list items equals to-dos.map, and for each to-do, I'm going to return a list item. Okay. And so what's important I mentioned here is for each list item, we're going to need a different key so the browser can differentiate these list items from each other, right? Because we're not actually creating literal ones, we're repeating through them. So if that's the case, then I'm just going to create a dynamic key variable equal to 0, and then we'll just increment that for each item in the list. Okay, and then from there we will display the to-do within the list. Okay, so now we have our list items. We can take those and we can pass them in as the value of the to-do list function. Okay, and as you can see here, we'll just say to-dos, or let's just do TD for to-dos. Okay, and then instead of passing in any actual hard-coded list items, we'll just pass in TD, and that will represent how many ever items are in the list, right? And that will produce a list item for each one. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's invoke this and see if we can have our list items displayed in the browser. Okay, so we come back and we can see that we get this nice unordered list, right? That accounts for every single item inside the list. Okay, so you'll notice if we cut this list in half now and we save all, it's just gonna calculate the new amount, loop through those, and produce list items for each one. Okay, and that's how we can deal with collections in JSX using this map method along with the iteration of to-dos. All right, so that's a pretty good amount of info so far. Let's go ahead and let's take a moment to open up the floor. Let's see if anyone has any questions so far. Okay, your mics are unmuted. If you have questions, feel free to ask them now. Okay, I don't hear anyone, so I'm assuming we're all good so far.
Yeah, I'm following.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and continue then. I'm gonna put you all back on mute and we'll open up the floor here in a little bit. Okay, so moving forward, let's go ahead and let's talk about React components. Okay, up until now, we've just really been dealing with JSX and simple rendering, but we haven't dealt with any components yet. Okay, and it's important to state that there's different kinds of components in React. Okay, the first kind of component we're going to be talking about is called a stateless component. Okay, and a stateless component means just that it doesn't have a state, so it basically can't hold information about itself, and it doesn't have access to lifecycle methods and things of that nature. And we'll get into a little bit more what that means when we talk about class components. But for now, just know that they are called stateless components, and they are going to be very similar to what we see with our function here, except for a couple small differences. Okay, so I could turn this into a stateless component by simply making it uppercase. Okay, that would be my first step, because all components have to be uppercase. Okay, and then I could just keep the context the same and return some markup. Okay, that's just fine. But here, when I pass it in to the render method, I have to pass it in as a component. How we do this is we pass it in just like an HTML element. So I would say to-do list. Okay, and then from here, I could pass it what's called props. Okay, and up until now, we've been passing in null for props, right? And so this is where props come into play. And props are like arguments we can pass to a function, right? So I'm going to simply pass in, let's say, let's get rid of our list here. Okay, and let's pass in to do one, and we'll say feed the cat, and we'll have to do two, And maybe we'll feed the fish. Today's the day to feed our pets. Okay, and finally, feed the dog. Okay, so now what we can do is we can populate this parameter field with a single parameter called props. Okay, and now props is an object that's going to contain each of these props passed in as a key value pair. Okay, so if I wanted to display 3 list items, I could simply do the following. I could say list item and then props dot td1. Okay, and then as you can imagine, I'll do the same for the other 2, except I'll just change out the numerical value to do number 2 and to do number 3. Okay, and this is what's called a stateless component. So now let's go ahead and save all and watch it compile. And as we can see, we're getting those 3 items rendered accordingly. Okay, so it's very similar to, what we would consider a function, except of course, we have the couple rules we've got to follow, right? Uppercase being one of the biggest, and then of course, the way you pass it in, you have to pass it in using these, arrow brackets, just like an HTML element. Okay, so now that we talked about a stateless component, next let's talk about a class component. Okay, so what a class component means is we're going to create a class, and we're going to store all the information about that component in a state. Okay, and also we're going to be extending component from the React library, so we're going to have access to what's called lifecycle methods, and we'll get into what those mean here in a bit. But for now, let's go ahead and let's just erase our current setup right here. Okay, and let's create our first class component, and we'll just do a simple to-do list like we've been doing, but we use a class component instead. So I'm going to say class. And then I'm going to say to-do list. Then I'm going to say extends React dot component. Okay, and if I wanted, I could destructure a component just like render here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I'll just say destructure component from React, and now I don't have to reference React every time I want to reference the component itself. Okay. So from here, we can go ahead and we can set up the render method. Okay, and render method is built into our class component. Okay, and it's going to return some markup. Okay, and so let's go ahead and let's just return a simple span right now. Okay, and then from here, we can go ahead and we can set up the render method. Okay, so we'll say render, and we'll pass in to-do list. Okay, and then we'll tell it to mount on the root element. Okay, so now we just need to add props, right? And so we can take those props and access them in a list here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pass in the parent unordered list element, and then I need to access the props on my class component to populate the list items. However, how we access props on a class component is different than a stateless component. Okay, and here's how. So the first, we'll add the to-dos. So we'll say to-do 1 equals, and we'll say go for a swim. Okay, to-do 2 will equal, let's see here, wash the dog. Oops. Okay, and to-do number 3 will equal, let's see here, hit the gym. That's always a good one. Okay, so now we've got our props passed in. If we want to access those, we have to use this keyword to reference the parent class first, and then we reference the props object. So it would go something like this. This.props dot to do one. Okay, so it's a slight difference, but nonetheless, it's an important difference. Okay, so we've got to do number 1, to do number 2, and to do number 3, all passed in here. And once the render method is invoked, it automatically runs, and we should see these 3 items displayed on our browser. Okay, so using this class component, let's go ahead and save all, and let's refresh. And as we can see, we're getting all 3 items. Okay, so that's how we can render using a class component. Okay, so next, let's talk about a high order component, sometimes referred to as a hawk. Okay, and so a high order component is simply when we nest class components within each other. Okay, and this is actually very common when we're integrating like third-party libraries and things of that nature. You're going to be nesting components in other components, which at that time it's considered a high order component. So I'm going to go ahead and erase my current logic here, and let's go ahead and let's say we have a bank account, and we want the total balance from that. Okay, and so this is where we could use 2 components and share their information between them to get that result. So I'm going to start off by creating the bank account component, and I'm going to make sure it extends the component. Okay, and from here, I'm going to go ahead and I want to set up my render method. Okay, so I'm going to say render. And in my render method, I need to return, let's start with a div. Okay, open and close. And then inside this, I want to mount my other component, okay, which let's call this component my total balance. Okay, so we'll say total balance extends component. Okay, and from here, I need to render a total balance. Okay, so I'm going to simply say H1 total balance, and then I'm going to take a value passed from the bank account component to the total balance component, and we will render that total amount here. So to do that, I'm going to need to pass props to my bank account whenever I mount the component initially. So let's go ahead and say render, and I'll pass in bank account, and I'll tell it to mount on the root. And from here, I can pass in my props. Okay, so let's say checking is equal to 100, and savings is equal to 200. Okay, so from here, I can go ahead and I can mount and nest my total balance component within my bank account component. Okay, and I can pass the checkings from this props to the props for my total balance. Okay, so I'm going to say this dot props dot checking, and the savings for total balance will be equal to this dot props dot savings. So now I have access to those 2 numbers within my total balance component. I can run a simple calculation with JSX. First, I'll use parse int to change these from strings to numbers. Okay, and so this dot props dot checking. And then I'll add that amount to the other account. Okay, so I'll say parse int this dot props dot savings. Okay, and so now whenever bank account is rendered, right, it's going to return the render method for total balance, which in turn is going to display this header tag with the calculated balance of both accounts added together. So let's go ahead and save all, and let's refresh, and we go back. Oh no, let's see here. Looks like I never used return. I put my render method, but I never said return. So let's go ahead and just throw that inside a return statement there. And let's try that one more time. Okay, so as you can see, we get a total balance of 300. And we know that's accurate because 100 plus 200 is 300. Okay, so just to test this out, we could simply say, okay, now checking is 1,000. And if we save all, we can see that will automatically update to that calculation, right? And so once again, this is how we can use higher order components to pass props between other components and nest them within each other, okay? So next, let's go ahead and talk about our class component state, okay? And so state is what holds all the information about our component and allows us to create these dynamic programs and operations. So let's consider we have a simple input-output scenario where we want to submit a value to a form and then output that to our browser, okay? So this is where state would come into play. So let's go ahead and let's create a state called greet, and we'll make it extend the component. And then from here, before I create my render method, I'm going to create the state, which is just this object here, okay? And so in my state, I can pass in key value pairs. So I'm going to just say my greeting input is going to be equal to null, and my greeting output will also be equal to null, okay? And so now I can update those, which in turn, using one-way data flow, will update what's seen as on the browser. Okay, so now comes into play where I bring in the render method, and I say return. And from here, we want to return two things, an input and an output, right? And so let's go ahead and we'll start with the output, and we'll close these both in the parent div element. And for the output, I'm simply going to reference the state. So I'm going to say this.state.greeting output. Okay. And then I'm going to put an input right below that. Okay. And this input is needing to change each time that there's a new value entered and then stored that value in the state, okay? And so what we need to do is we need to set up an on-change event. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the custom method called setValue, okay, which is going to take in the value of the event object, okay? And so I'm going to say onChange equals return this dot set value. Okay, and then we're just going to populate that with the event object so we can target the value from the input. Okay, so now I'm going to say this dot set state. Okay, and this is how we can update our state, right? It's going to load in at null, but we want to change that. So that's where this built-in set state method comes into play. Okay, and to use this, we just pass in an object, right, a key value pair. So I'm going to say the greeting output there we go, is going to be equal to the event object's target value. Okay, so I'm going to say e.target.value. Okay, and from here, we just need a way to submit that information and have it update accordingly. Okay, So let's go ahead and let's set up our render method so we can pass in the greet class component. Okay, so I'm going to say render, and we'll pass it in. And we don't need any props because all of our data is stored here, right, in the state. Okay, so from here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say document.get element by ID. Okay, and we'll pass in the root. Okay, so from here, let's save all. Watch it compile. Okay, everything good there. So we can see that whatever we type in is immediately bound to the output and displayed at the same time, right? And so this is how we can use the state to track the values from the operations happening on the client side and bind them to script values, right, within given functions. Okay, and so in the same way, maybe we only want to set the state when a button's clicked. Okay, instead of just setting it each time it's changed, well, then you would just connect that to a button instead of an on change event, like an on click, right? And so this is how you can control all of your interactions between the user and your other services, is by setting up a state and then updating that accordingly, which at that time, all the component information will be tracked. And you don't have to worry about having a big script file with a ton of different places where it might be. Each component has its own state, and therefore makes it much more organized in that regard. Okay, so now we have a good hang on how to work with the component state. Let's go ahead and let's move on to component lifecycle methods. Okay, so component lifecycle methods are these built-in methods that run at specific stages of the lifecycle. Where render, right? That's very much a lifecycle method, right? Because it runs right away. We don't have to tell render to run, right? It runs at a specific stage of the mounting process. And so in this way, we have some other built-in lifecycle methods. Actually, we got a good handful of them. And so today, let's just go over the two most used, okay? And that is component will mount and component did mount. Okay, and so let's say we wanted to go out and get some information and display it. Okay, so we know that there's going to be a few seconds while we're going out and retrieving this information, and we don't want to just leave the user hanging. So what we can do is we can use a component will mount method to give a user like a loading message or something, and then once we have the information, we can run the component did mount method, which will in turn display the given data. So today we're going to be making a request using the Axios library. Okay, and so if you don't know what Axios is, it's just an HTTP client. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to install it by saying npm install Axios -- save enter. Okay, that's going to bring it in for us. Okay, next step, I'm going to import Axios. Okay, so I'll say import Axios from Axios. Okay. Next, let's go ahead and let's get rid of this class component. Let's create a story class component. Okay, and the reason we're creating a story class component is because we're going to be requesting data from this Hacker News API. And this Hacker News API is full of a bunch of stories. Okay, and so we're going to try to get some data back like this to display. So I'm going to say class story extends component. Okay, and then we need to go ahead and we need to set up our method, which will run before the component mounts, right? Well, it's loading, so we'll say component will mount. And let's go ahead and let's throw a simple message in. We'll say loading. Okay. And then we'll set up the component did mount method. And once we're done loading, we can go ahead and we can use Axios to make a GET request to that Hacker News API and get data sent back to us. So I'm going to say axios.get. Now I need to pass in the endpoint. And if you notice, they provide these endpoints for us real easy right here, right? So we're just going to grab this, and presumably it will send us back this data. Okay, so I'll paste that in there like so. Then we can set up the callback function here, which will take the response that's sent back. And let's go ahead and let's console log the response. Okay, so from here, we'll go ahead and we'll throw a render method in, and we'll return a simple span element for the moment. Okay, and then we can run our render method, and we'll pass in story. It doesn't have any props, so we'll just tell it to mount from the root element. Okay, so now, just like we said, whenever we refresh, it's going to give us the loading message, and then as soon as that's done, it's going to display, print out the data that was sent back. Okay, and so let's go ahead and save all, and let's go back to our browser here, and let's see here. Looks like I never refreshed my Webpack server after I installed Axios. Let's go ahead and refresh that. And then let's just inspect the console. Okay, and just as expected, first we get the loading message, right? And then it displays the data that's sent back, right? And so we could actually take this data now and we can display it for the user to see. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna go ahead and let's just set up a state with a title and a URL. Okay, so I'm going to say state equals title null, URL null. Okay, and then once we get the data back, we'll say this dot state. Okay, and we'll start with the title. Title will be equal to res.data.title. And then the URL of the story will be equal to res.data.url. Okay, so from here, let's go ahead and display those different pieces of information. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll start with H1 for the title. And we're going to say this.state.title. Okay, and then we'll throw in an anchor tag right below that. The href will be equal to this.state.url. And then the actual context of the link will be equal to this.state.url. Okay, so now whenever it loads in, we should actually see story details displayed. Okay, let's go ahead and save all and go back to our browser. Okay, takes a moment, loads in, and as we can see, we're getting that data displayed now. Okay, and that's why we would want to use lifecycle methods, right? Because they allow us to execute different script dependent on different stages of the lifecycle. So that about ends it for today's material. Let's go ahead and open the floor one more time, and let's see if anyone has any last questions before we wrap up today. Any questions, folks? Everyone good? Okay, all right. I'm not hearing anyone, so thanks again for coming. Everyone have a great day, and happy coding out there. Thank you.
Thank you.